Hello everyone, it's June from Artsy Lola Co, and this video is going to be a quick tutorial where I will show you how to use my realistic watercolor brushes for Procreate. I will be painting a cookie for this demonstration so you can follow along. If you need help uploading the sketch, there is another video where I explain how to upload the sketches. If you don't have the brushes yet, I provided a link where you can get them in the description below. The sketch and the color palettes will be available for free. So let's get to it. And as you can see, I already have the sketch uploaded into my Procreate watercolor canvas. And if you open up the Layers tab, you can see my sketch is at the bottom and the brush guide is at the top. The brush guide has a brief explanation, all 16 brushes, on how to use them and what it's used for, and give you a little bit more detail on how to use them. And you could always turn this off for brush guide or turn it on when you need it. But make sure the watercolor texture canvas is always on when you are painting. And we are currently using the small rough canvas. But you can use whatever canvas you wish to follow along. And once you upload the sketch, it's going to be in the center. And if you are enjoying these tutorials, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. So now when we are painting, we want to paint at the layer where it says paint here. And every layer that we're going to use, it's going to be at the bottom of the watercolor texture canvas. This will give the paintbrushes the watercolor texture look and working properly. So there are 16 brushes, but if you watched my previous videos tutorials, you can see that I mainly use the wet on dry brush, smooth brush, the moving blender and regular blender, and the fine line brush, including the gouache brush. All the other brushes are great, but those are the basic brushes that I use for most of my paintings. But for this video, I'm going to explain each brush. So we're going to start off as usual with my wet on dry brush. So I picked a very light brown color for this cookie to begin with. And as usual, I like to start with lighter tone colors, mid-tone colors, and the dark tone colors. I like to paint majority of the area surface with a light tone color and make my way through the mid and the dark tones. So I'm going to keep the opacity to around 100, but if I want to keep the edges a little bit darker and the center a bit more transparent, I'm going to reduce the opacity, but for this, I'm going to keep it at 100. And one of the fastest ways and the most impactful thing that you can do, traditional or digital art, it's creating value and depth, which is critical, bringing the realism into the art piece, as it creates a sense of three-dimensional or two-dimensional surface, and it guides the viewer's eye through the artwork rather than just being flat. You don't have to be super precise with this process because it is watercolor, it's very forgiving. And with this process, I don't want to add too much overlaps, and I try to do it with one stroke, but it doesn't really make a huge difference, and it's not the end of the world if you do have another overlap. So when you do have another overlay, it kind of resets the paintbrushes to its original color, and it darkens the area. But we can utilize this a little bit better moving forward by creating a different layer. And when you create a new layer, it creates a darker, more defined edge, which is great for that realistic feel. And as you can see here, the wet on dry brush really is pressure sensitive. So if you put less pressure, it's going to be very small and fine. But when you do put a pressure, that is going to be making the brush a lot bigger. And this really depends on the size of the brush. So if you want to reduce this variation of the sizes, you can reduce the size and put the pressure evenly as it will stay consistent. But as you can see, it will still taper off even though the size is reduced, but not as much of a variation as when you increase the size. Now we're going to add a mid-tone color by creating a new layer and then going a little bit darker than we already had originally. So we're going to increase the size to around 50%, and we're going to do the mid-tone colors on the left side. And have some fun with this because we're going to be blending, so it doesn't have to be so perfect. And I filled a little bit on the top right corner because it looks like the cookie has been chipped off, adding a little bit of quirkiness and uniqueness to the painting. And now we're going to darken it by adding another darker tone. And we're going to do the outside. And the reason why I'm having the darker side on the left, because I want the light source to be coming from the top. So whenever you are painting, you have to figure out where the light source is coming from to give that three-dimensional look, to also give more depth and value as I mentioned before. So from here, it's going to be coming from the right corner. And that's why I put a little bit of shadow sketch at the bottom left corner. And now before I move on with the next step of this process, I want to explain the brushes here, which is the wet on wet brush. And let's say you don't want to use the wet on dry brush with the darker tones, you can use this to darken the area by giving that natural pigment mixture that is included in the wet on wet brush. And the wet on wet brush does really well with creating clouds, as I will show you right here. So pick a very light blue color, almost white, because the wet on wet brush really increases the intensity of the pigment. So for demonstration, I'm going to increase the size and do it on the top right corner. And this creates a wet surface texture look, creating soft, diffused edges, ideal for painting mist, fog, or other atmosphere. And for this, it's going to be a cloud. Again, it's a bit boring at this point, but we can add by putting a bit more texture and value into this painting. So I put a little bit more darker tone. And now we're going to start blending the two tones color by using the moving blender. And when I start blending, I want to combine the layers together, just like this, by pinching with your two fingers. And just move up and down, wiggling around to mix in those two pigments. And that's just a really quick demonstration on how to use this. And next we have the smooth brush. And it's a little bit different from the wet on dry brush. It doesn't have the hard edges that usually happens when the paint dries in watercolor. But the smooth brush is a bit more opaque and consistent and doesn't have the hard edge. But when you increase the pressure, it spreads the paint and becomes a little bit more thin, mimicking the actual traditional watercolor brushes that's been used. And I know a lot of people really enjoy using pre-made stamps watercolor brushes, but I really enjoy the unique artistic identity that creates with original brushes like this. It does take some time and skill to develop these, but it's so much more satisfying knowing that you can create pretty much anything as long as you are able to do them. So the smooth brush is almost the same as the rough round brush, but the rough round brush is a bit more rougher edges to give it a little bit more texture. And it's great for using flower petals or actual flower pistils to bring some unique textures into it. Hard edge is ideal for creating darker and more defined edges, which enhances the contrast and the textures. So for example, let's say you used the smooth brush, but you also want that hard edge effect, you can add it. So to demonstrate, I'll get rid of the sketch and I'll try to find the area where I want to put more hard edges. And we're going to create a new layer and I'll show you how to use this. Now, if you move to the direction of the right, the hard edges will be on the top. And if you move the brush to the left, it'll be hard edges at the bottom. Just like this. So let's say I want to make the cookie on the right side a little bit darker, I can do this. Most of the time I'm going in one direction to make sure that the hard edges are going to be showing. So now moving on to the wet to dry brush. The brush is designed to emulate the transition from wet to dry finish of watercolor paint, gradually switching to a more drier texture, achieving a natural gradient and adding a little bit more depth in it. Putting in a little bit more pressure and tapering off. It is very versatile and can also be blended very effortlessly. Now moving on to the soft Blotch, which is an excellent tool for creating subtle, organic textures, smooth transition from watercolor painting. Ideal for laying down areas in the background, skies, water, atmosphere backgrounds, and so on. For this demonstration, I'll do the background of the cookie, which is mainly the shadows. And make sure when you want to put something in the background, you put it at the bottom of the layers. And here's a quick tip. For shadows, I like to use a cool blue tone, not completely black, as it will make the image a little bit more flat and lifeless. Blue, on the other hand, maintains a vibrancy and a bit more realistic feel. Because in reality, shadows are not really pure black. It contains some light from the environment, and blue does a really great job with this. Now, before moving on to the salt brush, I want to combine and blend the colors, and then I'll explain the salt. So to begin the blending process, I want to combine all the layers that I want to blend, and simply using your fingers to pinch all the layers together. And select that layer, and we're going to zoom in a little bit. And when I want to use the moving blender, I just want to mix two-tone colors by wiggling it around up and down. Nothing too crazy, just keep it simple. And the regular blender is really great for pressing out the colors of pigments, but moving blender mixes the colors, two pigments together very well. And just like this. And it'll mix in the color just like watercolor style. And you don't want to mix too much that it smudges the paint. You just want to mix enough to blend the colors together. So I'll use the regular blender to push out the dark pigments into the light pigment to give that mixture of water feel. So let's say I want to move that dark wet to dry effect here. And I can simply do that by pushing it out just like this. Now we're going to go back a step, back to the salt brush, and I'll show you how to use this properly. The salt brush is a very versatile tool in watercolor painting. It replicates the effects of sprinkling salt on wet paint, which creates a granular, crystalline texture where the salt actually absorbs the water. Unfortunately, I don't want you guys to put actual salt on your iPads, so I made a brush just for this purpose. It creates almost a natural texture for sandy beaches, starry nights, frosted surfaces. So to achieve this, we're going to use the eraser tool and pick the salt brush as an eraser. And as you can see, the brush offers precise control, allowing for more detailed and intentional application. But for this painting, I'm not going to utilize the painting for the salt brush. But there is a very unique way you can actually use this. By utilizing the brush not as an eraser and adding color, it creates almost a backwash cauliflower effect, so they call it in watercolor painting, which creates more of a wet on wet effect where the water carries and spreads the pigment outwards. So pick a pigment that's dark by using your finger and hovering over the area. And this creates a very nice backwash effect, which adds a unique texture look. Now this creates a very dynamic pigment look. As you can see, it's kind of like spreading out, kind of like spider webs. And it's very useful to do it in the darker areas as well, because it gives a better contrast between the light and the dark. So now let's say you made a mistake and you've gone over the edges where you don't want the colors to be. I recommend using the eraser tool and picking the fine line brush. The fine line brush is very precise and gives a lot of control while achieving very clean lines and edges, so it doesn't look so perfect when you erase with digital brushes. Now moving forward with using the fine line brush, it is very useful because it is very precise while also maintaining a very intricate detailed edges. Very useful for anything, really. So for this, I picked the chocolate chip cookies to be used with the fine line brush. Now with the chocolate, I would want to add a little bit more texture rather than keeping it so flat. So I'm going to put two-tone colors, a little bit light when it's closer to the light coming from the right, and it's a bit darker on the left bottom side. So I picked around a dark brown tone and just painted on the top right corners. As you can see, it's very easy to correct yourself or use the eraser with the fine line tool without compromising the integrity of the surrounding areas and keeping it clean. So with the fine line brush, we don't need to make another layer to create the second tone. So we're gonna pick a darker brown tone color and paint the bottom left corner now. As you can see, by simply adding two tones, the painting just looks a lot better than rather than just having one tone color. So for this cookie, I gave it that cookie cracking look between the chocolate chip cookies. To make this, I went back to the history of the color palette and picked the tone that we used before for the mid-tone. And as you can see, it's still too dark, but I want to make it a bit more transparent. So I used this technique to reduce the transparency of the fine line brush by reducing the opacity on the left corner here to around 50%, where it allows you to use the fine line brush with precision, but as well as reduced opacity to be more transparent. So I'm giving that cookie crumbling effect like it's freshly baked. I try my best with my paintings to keep it as simple as I can to allow people to try, but at the same time, make it look realistic. And I'll demonstrate here. The fine line brush is very versatile because it puts a lot of pressure and reduced, and it tapers off very nicely to a very fine detail, which is one of my favorite brushes to use because it's very fun to use and very useful. So now moving on to the gouache brush, and when I use this brush, I want to use it on the gouache layer. And the reason why I have it at the top is to make it a bit more opaque and on top of the watercolor texture. And it's great to achieve solid, vibrant colors, and especially for this process, I want the whites of the top of the cookie light reflection to be very solid. So I'm going to keep it to the white color and keep it at 100% opacity and reduce the size to around 15 to 20%. So I'm going to paint on the top right corner where the light reflection is. The gouache brush provides a very smooth, matte finish, reducing glare from anything, while ideally it's great for flat, even surfaces, but can be used for round surfaces like this. Now, if you think the colors are too solid and you want to mix a little bit of the colors back into the background, you can always go to the adjustments and pick the Gaussian blur. And by pressing on the screen, you can slide to the right to increase the blur and go to the left to reduce the blur. Now moving on to the brush called the Pencil 2B, it is very versatile and useful to make any sketches. For example, this cookie, I used this pencil to create the sketch. And this brush closely simulating the experience and the effects of traditional pencil drawing, especially with the canvas that we are using. It's kind of like a cold press paper. So I added some textures and variations of thickness. Now moving on to the gel pen brush, which is great for outlining the watercolor painting that you completed. So we're going to remove the sketch and I'll show you. And people use pens to emphasize a certain elements of the painting and key areas, just like this. And it can sometimes correct the edges of watercolor areas. But I'm not going to use the pen for this illustration. Now moving on with the Epic Splash brush, and this really introduces a sense of spontaneously movement and dropping of the splash effects of watercolor. It makes things a lot more engaging and less flat. And it really gives that signature look of watercolor. So we're using a lot of brown with this cookie, so we're going to use that color, increase the size, and just randomly drop them in there. As you can see, it's just like you were flicking the brush into the painting. And sometimes I like to put different tone colors to make it a little bit more fun, just like this. And the flickering effect brush is basically the same thing, but it's a bit more detailed and smaller. Almost like you're using a smaller brush to flick the paint into the canvas. And you can do this with putting the paint into the cookies to give that little sprinkle, great for desserts and so on. And the best part about using Procreate or digital art, just have fun with it, no worries, you can just get rid of it. So I want to give this unique tip to a lot of people that wonder how I make that hard edge look after it's been finished. So to do this technique, you have to use the wet on dry brush, but with reduced opacity. So I'll demonstrate this right now. So pick the wet on dry brush, and rather than just painting over this with more of solid colors, we can actually maintain the hard edge pigment while keeping the solid colors in the middle more transparent. As you can see, I'm going to reduce the opacity here. And you can just tell the difference between the pigment that we put in before. It's a lot more transparent on the center. And we can even take it further by reducing the opacity. And as you can see, it's a lot more transparent, but the edges are still there, which is what we want when paint dries. This is great to put a little bit more texture into this. Like the cookie areas where it's crumbling, I want to keep it a little bit darker. And of course, the edges of the dark side of the areas in the left corner. Now, I like to use the soft blush for backgrounds and shadows, but for this, I'm going to use the wet on dry brush to demonstrate another technique, like I used one before by reducing the opacity. So I picked a really dark blue color and picked the wet on dry brush and reduced the opacity to around 25%. Now this really makes the paint more transparent, but the hard edges is very visible still. And to add another second tone, we can increase the opacity and put more shadowing, darker pigment closer to the cookie where it's a bit darker. And now to push the effects of the watercolor, we're going to use the regular brush and push outwards. And if you don't want too much pigment, you can always push it back and mix in with the colors. And that is a very short, condensed explanation of the brushes. I'll be making a lot more tutorials utilizing other brushes, trying different techniques to help you guys learn. I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial. And if you have any questions, you can contact us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And if you haven't done so, please like, subscribe to my channel. And as always, have a wonderful day.